Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight, we begin with something very strange. How did kings and queens sleep in medieval castles during harsh winters without modern heating? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world.
The tapestry membrane, weaving an internal skin. If the limestone masonry was the castle's ironclad armor, the tapestries were its soft, insulating fleece. To a king or queen in the 14th century, a bare stone wall was more than just an aesthetic void. It was a radiant predator. Even with a fire roaring in the hearth, an unadorned masonry surface would continue to behave as a heat sink, greedily absorbing the room's energy and drawing warmth away from the skin through a process of thermal siphonage. To combat this, the medieval aristocracy developed a secondary interior architecture, a textile barrier that served as a biological shield against the mineral world. The physics of the air gap. The primary function of a great hanging was the creation of stagnant air. When a heavy wool tapestry was suspended from a wooden cleat an inch or two away from the masonry, it established a dead air zone. This narrow pocket functioned exactly like the gap in a modern double-paned window or the loft in a high-end sleeping bag. Because the air trapped behind the fabric was restricted from circulating, it became a stagnant layer of insulation. While the stone wall behind it might be freezing to the touch, the tapestry itself remained at room temperature. This prevented the convective drafts that typically occur when warm air hits a cold surface, cools rapidly, and sinks to the floor, creating those phantom breezes that haunt old buildings. By clothing the room in wool, the royalty effectively stopped the wall from breathing its chill into the living space. For the monarch sitting near the wall, the tapestry replaced the icy bite of the limestone with the neutral radiance of the fabric. It was a manual redirection of physics, ensuring that the room's warmth stayed where it was needed, near the people. The loom as a thermal factory. To the American listener accustomed to lightweight synthetic curtains, it is hard to grasp the sheer physical presence of a medieval hanging. These were not decorative accents, they were industrial-grade insulators. In the great weaving centers of Arras in Flanders, artisans worked with heavy-gauge wool to create a material of immense density. A single chamber hanging could weigh over 100 pounds and be half an inch thick. This weight was crucial for structural integrity. A thick, heavy textile did not sway or flutter in the minor drafts of a keep. It sat like a solid pavement against the air. The fibers themselves, predominantly sheep's wool, possess a unique molecular resilience. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling damp. In the humid, foggy winters of northern Europe, these tapestries acted as atmospheric regulators, sucking the excess moisture out of the castle air. This was vital because dry cold is much easier for the human body to endure than damp cold. By keeping the air dry, the tapestries ensured that the warmth from the hearth was more effective, preventing that bone-deep shiver that comes from saturated, frigid air. The sensory barrier, muffling the stone. Beyond the thermal benefits, the membrane of wool served a profound psychological and acoustic purpose. A stone castle is an acoustic nightmare. Sounds of clanking iron, barking hounds, and whistling winds echo endlessly off the hard, reflective surfaces. This acoustic chaos can make an environment feel colder and more hostile to the human nervous system. Tapestries acted as sound dampeners, swallowing the echoes and creating a muffled sanctuary. This softening of the environment allowed for a deeper, more restorative sleep. When the queen retired, the tapestries absorbed the ambient noise of the watchman and the shifting of the fire. Furthermore, these textiles served as the final barrier against light. In an era where the rising sun or a flickering torch could disrupt the circadian rhythm, the dense weave of the wool ensured absolute obscurity. The royal chamber became a woven vault, a place where the senses were shielded as much as the skin. The winter migration of the hangings. Warmth in the castle was fluid and mobile. In the summer months, these heavy woolens were often taken down and stored in cedar chests to prevent moth damage and to allow the cool stones to lower the interior temperature. The arrival of the winter skin was a ritualistic event of the court. As the first frost silvered the battlements, the household staff would begin the great draping.
They didn't just hang scenes of hunts or biblical stories on the walls, they used textiles to redefine the space. They would hang tapestries across the center of large halls to create temporary thermal zones, effectively cutting a massive, unheatable gallery into a series of smaller, cozy fabric cubes. This mobile architecture allowed the inhabitants to adjust the castle's volume to match the available fuel. They weren't just living in a building, they were living inside a customized textile shell that expanded and contracted with the seasons. It was a sophisticated way of shrinking the castle during the months of the Great Stasis. The legend of the warm surface. To the touch, a tapestry in winter was a gentle revelation. If one were to lean against the bare stone, the body's heat would be sapped instantly, leading to a conductive shock. Leaning against a tapestry, however, felt neutral. The wool didn't try to take anything from the person. This thermal passivity was the secret to medieval luxury. In the royal bedchamber, this was taken to the extreme. Not only were the walls covered, but the bed itself was enclosed in wadmall or velvet curtains. This created a room within a room within a room. By the time the king climbed into the high mattress, he was separated from the limestone reality of the castle by 3 distinct layers of air and 4 layers of textile. He slept in a biothermal envelope, where the only heat source required was his own steady, quiet metabolism. As the wind howled through the battlements and the moat turned to solid ice, the royalty rested in a stone cocoon lined with the finest work of the loom. The infinite loom had woven a skeletal and fibrous shield that allowed the medieval mind to drift into dreams of spring, while the absolute zero of the world outside was held at bay by a velvet latch and the quiet, insulating breath of the wool. The great hall's respiration, banking the midnight hearth. If the limestone walls were the castle's flesh and the tapestries its clothing, then the hearth was its metabolic core. In the medieval mindset, fire was not merely a utility, it was a living participant in the household's survival. To the American listener, accustomed to the on-off binary of a modern furnace, the medieval hearth represents a different kind of relationship with energy, one of constant calibration and rhythmic respiration. In the great hall of a king, the fire was never truly extinguished, from the first frost of autumn to the final thaw of spring. It was a perpetual engine that breathed alongside the inhabitants. The physics of the centralized radiant mass. In the early and high medieval periods, many great halls utilized a central hearth rather than a wall-mounted fireplace. This was a strategic choice in atmospheric engineering. By placing the fire in the dead center of the room on a raised stone dais, the builder ensured that heat radiated in a perfect 360-degree radius. This created a thermal dome. As the fire burned, it heated the massive stones of the hearth floor, turning the very ground into a secondary radiator. Even after the flames subsided, these stones would continue to emit long-wave infrared radiation for hours. This deep heat was more effective than the flash heat of a modern space heater because it warmed the objects and people in the room directly, rather than just the air. For the royal court gathered around the fire, the great hall became a fluid landscape of warmth, where the air was constantly circulating, rising to the high rafters and cooling, then sinking back down to be re-energized by the glowing heart of the dais. The stack effect and the science of the Louvre. One of the greatest challenges of a central hearth was the management of smoke without losing the precious warm air. To solve this, medieval architects designed the Louvre, a wooden turret or opening in the roof directly above the hearth. The Louvre was an analog pressure valve. It relied on the stack effect, where the buoyancy of hot air creates a natural upward draft. The trick was to keep the opening large enough to exhaust the wood smoke, but small enough to prevent a thermal hemorrhage. Often these turrets were fitted with adjustable slats that could be turned against the wind, much like a modern weather vane. By throttling the Louvre, the castle's steward could control the respiration rate of the hall. On a particularly bitter night, the slats would be narrowed to a sliver, trapping a thick blanket of warm air in the upper third of the hall, which acted as an additional layer of insulation against the roof timbers.
The alchemy of the wood. Selecting the fuel. The quality of the heat depended entirely on the chemistry of the fuel. A king's woodsman did not simply throw any branch onto the fire, he practiced silvicultural calibration. Oak and beech, these were the long burners. Dense and heavy, they provided the basal energy for the day, burning with a steady, intense heat that created a deep bed of glowing coals. Ash, known as the king of woods, could be burned green if necessary, but when seasoned, it provided a bright, clean flame with minimal smoke, perfect for the hours when the court was gathered for the evening meal. Fruit woods, like apple and cherry, were often reserved for the royal solar, providing a sensory luxury with their sweet scented smoke. The goal was to build a fuel matrix that would result in a massive reservoir of white ash and red charcoal by the time the household retired. This charcoal was the true prize of the medieval knight. Unlike an open flame, which is volatile and consumes oxygen rapidly, a bed of charcoal is a steady-state energy source. It emits a consistent, flameless heat that can be guided through the dark hours. The ritual of the couvre-feu, or curfew. As the midnight hour approached, the most critical thermal act of the day took place, the banking of the coals. This is the origin of our modern word curfew, derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. The steward or a trusted servant would use a large bell-shaped metal or ceramic cover with small ventilation holes. Instead of letting the fire burn out or dousing it with water, which would be a catastrophic waste of energy, they would rake the glowing coals into a tight mound and cover them with a layer of insulating ash. The couvre-feu was then placed over the mound. This oxygen deprivation slowed the combustion to a near halt. The fire wasn't dying, it was hibernating. Inside that ash-covered mound, the temperature remained high enough to keep the hearth stones vibrating with heat, but low enough that the fuel would last until dawn. For the king sleeping in the gallery above, the hearth became a low-frequency radiator.
The scent of the banked hearth, a dry, toasted aroma, was the atmospheric signal that the castle was in maintenance mode. It was the sonic and olfactory proof that the internal engine was still pulsing, holding the great stasis of the winter at bay while the world slept. The reed and rush meadow, natural insulation underfoot. While the tapestries shielded the skin from the walls and the hearth warmed the air, the most persistent threat to medieval comfort lay beneath the soles of the feet. In a stone castle, the floor is the ultimate heat thief. Large flagstones or packed earth serve as a constant thermal drain, pulling caloric energy directly from the human body through the process of conduction. To combat this, medieval society didn't just clean their floors, they engineered them. The result was a thick, fragrant and highly effective organic carpet known as the rush strewing. The physics of the fibrous barrier. Stone is an exceptional conductor of cold. Without an intervening layer, a person standing on a limestone floor is effectively tethered to the bedrock. To break this connection, the medieval household utilized cellular air traps. Rushes, straw, and hay are composed of hollow tubes. When layered inches thick across a great hall, these tubes create millions of micro pockets of dead air. This is the principle of loft, similar to how a modern down jacket or fiberglass insulation works. By trapping the air within the fibrous mass, the rushes prevented the warmth of the room from ever reaching the cold stone below. Instead of a heat sink, the floor became a thermal buffer. For the American reader, this represents a transition from a hard surface reality to a textural landscape, where the floor was a living, breathing component of the home's insulation. The harvest of the marsh, material selection. The resilience of the floor depended on the quality of the material. The most prized plant was the sweet flag, or the common bulrush. These plants were harvested from riverbanks and marshes, dried until they were supple but tough, and then transported to the castle in massive bundles. Unlike straw, which can be brittle and busty, rushes are waxy and durable. They possessed a mechanical springiness that could withstand the constant traffic of heavy leather boots, hunting dogs, and the dragging of oak furniture. This elasticity was crucial. A flattened floor is a failed insulator. By maintaining its volume, the rush strewing ensured that the dead air zone remained intact throughout the winter. The scent of a freshly strewn floor was a botanical symphony, a sharp green aroma that signaled the biotic vitality of the household. The aromatic layering, sensory and sanitary management. A medieval floor was a multi-sensory archive. Because the rushes were not changed every day, they were layered with antimicrobial herbs. This was a biochemical defense against the inevitable accumulation of debris. Housewives and stewards would scatter handfuls of lavender, tansy, meadowsweet, and mint into the rushes. When people walked across the floor, their weight would rhythmically crush the herbs, releasing essential oils into the air. This wasn't just for fragrance. Many of these plants served as natural repellents for fleas, lice, and flies. It turned the floor into a scented battery, where every footfall contributed to the atmospheric hygiene of the room. This layering created a secondary metabolism for the castle, where the floor helped process the odors of a crowded indoor life. The winter thickening, the seasonal accretion. In the height of summer, a thin layer of rushes was sufficient for cleanliness, but in the deep freeze of January, the floor underwent a thermal augmentation. New layers were added on top of the old, creating a mat of insulation that could be several inches thick. This accretion of fiber meant that the floor became physically soft. The sound of the castle changed. The clatter of the hall was replaced by a muffled hush. This acoustic softening was an essential part of the winter experience. It reduced the perceived cold by removing the sharp echoing sounds associated with frozen stone. The floor became a tactile sanctuary, a place where children could play and dogs could sleep without ever touching the icy reality of the masonry. The metabolism of the waste. The boring history of the medieval floor is often misunderstood as a sign of filth. However, the internal life of the rushes was a slow-motion recycling system. While it is true that bones and scraps from the table might find their way into the depths, the dry and alkaline nature of the straw and the antimicrobial herbs helped to mummify organic waste. Eventually, the entire floor would be stripped. This was a massive communal effort, where the old, compacted meadow was raked up and carried out to the bardens or the fields. This was a nutrient loop. The floor of the castle became the fertilizer for the next spring's crops. This cyclical maintenance ensured that the biological insulation was never permanent but always renewable.
The sleep of the hearthside. For those sleeping in the Great Hall, guards, travelers, and lower status servants, the reed meadow was their mattress. They did not lie on the stone, they lay on the thermal protection of the rushes. By placing a wool cloak or a simple sheepskin over the thick mat of straw, they could tap into the residual heat of the hearth while remaining insulated from the sovereign cold of the earth. This low-level living was a strategic choice. By staying within the warm air pool near the floor's insulation and the banked coals, the sleepers survived the nights that would have frozen a man to death on bare granite. The reed and rush meadow was the final layer of the cocoon, a vegetable shield that turned a cold mineral fortress into a hospitable bio-shelter. As the wind howled through the battlements, the inhabitants rested on a fabric of the marsh, a soft, fragrant, and insulating foundation that held the great stasis of the winter at bay. The solar retreat, the architecture of the pocket. If the Great Hall was the civic lung of the castle, vast, airy, and difficult to regulate, the solar was its thermal sanctuary. As the medieval winter intensified, the inhabitants engaged in a strategic spatial contraction. They recognized that heating a volume of air 30 feet high was a thermodynamic fool's errand. Instead, they moved their lives into the architecture of the pocket. The solar, or the private withdrawing room, was the ultimate heat trap, designed to leverage the biological radiance of a small group of people within a highly insulated wood-paneled nest. The physics of volumetric reduction. The primary enemy of warmth is excess volume. In a large hall, the heat from a fire dissipates rapidly as it rises into the rafters, leaving the human-occupied zone cold. The solar solved this through geometric scaling. These rooms were designed with lower ceilings and smaller floor plans. By reducing the cubic footage of the environment, the medieval architect ensured that every calorie of energy produced by a small fireplace, or even the collective metabolic output of several people, had a measurable impact on the air temperature. This was microclimate management. In the American context, it is the difference between trying to heat a warehouse and heating a walk-in closet. The solar was an atmospheric container. Because the room was small, the air could be charged with heat quickly.
Once the room reached a comfortable temperature, the thick walls and thermal barriers ensured that the rate of loss was significantly slowed, creating a stable, warm interior horizon that could be maintained with a fraction of the fuel used in the hall below. The timber lining, breaking the mineral connection. While the exterior walls remained massive limestone, the interior was often encased in oak or pine paneling, known as wainscoting. This was a thermal divorce from the bedrock. Wood has much lower thermal conductivity than stone, while limestone acts as a heat sponge, constantly sucking energy out of the room. Wood acts as a reflector. The wooden panels felt warm to the touch because they did not leach heat from the skin as rapidly as masonry. Furthermore, the installation of wainscoting created another dead air gap between the wood and the stone. This composite wall functioned as a medieval form of rigid foam insulation, ensuring that the radiant cold of the castle's core never made contact with the room's atmosphere. The nest instinct, the alcove and the wall chamber. Within the solar itself, there was a further nesting of space. Medieval builders often carved wall chambers directly into the thickness of the masonry. These were essentially holes in the fortress, but when lined with furs and cushions, they became the ultimate biothermal pods. These alcoves served as reading nooks or sleeping niches. By sitting inside the wall, the inhabitant was surrounded by three sides by thermal mass that had been warmed by the room's air. This created a cocoon effect, where the radiant symmetry of the small space reflected the body's own heat back upon itself. It was the manual optimization of comfort, a realization that the most efficient way to stay warm was to occupy the smallest possible structural void.
The looming furniture. The bed as a building. The ultimate expression of the solar retreat was the bed. In the medieval mind, a bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a self-contained architecture. The four-poster bed with its celestial canopy and heavy velvet curtains was a room within a room. When the curtains were drawn, the volume of air to be heated was reduced from that of a room to that of a large box. The occupant's own breath and body pulse would raise the temperature inside the bed curtains by 10 to 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. This was biological autonomy. The castle could be freezing, the solar could be chilly, but the bed environment remained a tropical microzone. This layered enclosure ensured that the history of sleep was one of protected stasis, where the mineral reality of the castle was rhythmically redacted by layers of oak, wool, and linen. The social heat, the communal withdrawal. The solar was also the site of social compression. Privacy, in the modern sense, was a thermal liability. In the deep winter, the lord, his family, and high-ranking attendants would gather in the solar to share the shared radiance. This was the physics of the huddle. By concentrating the biological energy of 10 people into a room designed for 5, they created a shared metabolism. The sound of the solar was intimate and muffled. The hiss of a small fire, the soft murmur of conversation, and the rustle of silk and fur. This communal living was a strategic response to the astringent cold. They were pooling their heat, turning the social unit into a heat-generating organism. Finally, the solar was a sanctuary of light. Because the room was small and wood-lined, a few tallow candles or a single soapstone lamp could illuminate the entire space. This visual warmth had a profound effect on the perceived temperature. A well-lit room feels warmer than a dark one.
The luminous density of the solar, the light reflecting off the polished oak and the gold-threaded tapestries created an aesthetic of comfort. The inhabitants weren't just surviving the stone, they were refining the dark. The solar was the final bastion of the medieval home, a rhythmic retreat into a world of wood and fabric where the great stasis of the winter was held at bay by the passive engineering of the alcove and the quiet radiance of the human huddle. The celestial bed, the sovereign survival pod. In the hierarchy of medieval comfort, the bed was not merely a piece of furniture, it was the ultimate interior. While the castle provided the shell and the solar provided the room, the celestial bed, the four-poster, canopied bed, functioned as a biological micro-chamber. For a king or queen, the bed was a high-performance survival pod, a masterpiece of passive thermal enclosure designed to trap and recycle every joule of energy emitted by the human body during the 8 hours of the nocturnal stasis. The physics of the enclosed volume. To understand the genius of the four-poster bed, one must look at it through the lens of volumetric containment. A standard medieval bedchamber might contain 3,000 cubic feet of air. Heating that entire volume to a comfortable sleeping temperature in a limestone keep was an impossible task. The celestial bed, however, created a secondary architecture. By drawing the heavy velvet or wool curtains around the perimeter of the bed, the occupant reduced the relevant atmosphere from 3,000 cubic feet to a mere 150 cubic feet. This was geometric efficiency. Within this small fabric-lined box, the laws of thermodynamics worked in the sleeper's favor. The heat generated by a resting adult human, approximately 100 watts of energy, is insufficient to warm a large room, but it is more than enough to charge a small enclosed space. Within 20 minutes of drawing the curtains, the temperature inside the bed could rise by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient room temperature. The celestial canopy, preventing the heat leak. The term celestial refers to the wooden or fabric tester or ceiling of the bed. In the physics of the vertical draft, heat naturally rises. In an open bed, the warmth of the sleeper's body and breath would float upward and be lost to the high rafters of the stone chamber. The tester functioned as a thermal dam. It captured the rising heat and reflected it back down onto the mattress. This created a circular convection within the bed curtains. The sleeper's own breath, warmed by their lungs, would hit the canopy, linger, and eventually settle back down as a cloud of warmth. This was respiratory recycling. For the monarch, the celestial was the final seal of the cocoon, ensuring that the plume of warmth they generated stayed within their personal horizon. The mattress stack, engineering the deep warmth. The bed was not just an enclosure, it was a geological formation of insulating materials. A royal bed was built in layers, each serving a specific thermal function. The straw base, a thick mat of fresh, dry straw at the very bottom, provided the structural insulation from the cold wooden frame. The wool mattress, several inches of packed sheep's wool, acted as the static heat reservoir holding the body's energy. The down tick, the uppermost mattress was filled with swan or goose down. Down is the gold standard of medieval insulation because its three-dimensional structure traps the maximum amount of air per gram. The linen sheets, these served as the moisture regulator, wicking away perspiration to keep the skin dry. This stacking of densities ensured that no heat was lost to the underside of the bed. The sleeper was essentially floating on a cloud of trapped air, completely decoupled from the mineral reality of the floor. The velvet latch, the mechanical seal of the curtains. The curtains themselves were the industrial valves of the bed. Made of double-sided velvet or heavy boiled wool, they possessed enough mechanical weight to hang perfectly straight, sealing the gaps between the curtains and the bedposts. When the velvet latch was closed, it created a static air buffer. Even if a draft managed to penetrate the stone window shutters and the wall tapestries, it would be stopped dead by the weight of the bed curtains. This was atmospheric redundancy. The king slept in a series of concentric shields where the bed curtains were the final, most intimate barrier. The sound inside the bed was absolute silence, the acoustic proof of a perfect thermal seal. The scent of the sanctuary, the olfactory sleep aid. Because the air inside the bed was stagnant and recycled, it became saturated with the scent of the sanctuary. The linens were often stored in chests with dried lavender, rose petals, and sweet woodruff. Within the celestial bed, this fragrance became concentrated. The olfactory density acted as a biological signal for the brain to enter deep REM sleep. The scent of sun-dried linen and floral herbs, combined with the deep warmth of the down mattress, created a sensory illusion of summer. Outside the curtains, the castle might be enduring a glacial advance, but inside the sovereign pod, the king lived in a perpetual June. The ritual of the unveiling. The spring awakening of the bed occurred every morning. When the curtains were pulled back, a plume of stale, warm air would rush out, meeting the astringent morning cold of the chamber. This was the daily thaw. The occupant would emerge from the celestial pod like a creature leaving a cocoon, re-energized by a night of high-efficiency stasis. The bed had done more than just provide comfort. It had arrested the decay of the body's energy. The celestial bed was the crowning achievement of medieval interior engineering, a mobile architecture that turned the infinite history of the winter into a boring history of sleep and stability.
The linen layers, engineering the royal wardrobe. In the medieval winter, warmth was not something you dialed in on a wall, it was something you wore. If the castle was the shell and the bed was the pod, then the clothing was the primary envelope. For a king or queen, dressing for a January day was an exercise in sartorial stratification, a complex layering of biological fibers designed to create a personal microclimate that moved with the body. To the American eye, accustomed to the single-layer warmth of a heavy puffer jacket, the medieval approach was far more sophisticated, relying on the physics of multi-stage insulation. The first layer, the linen foundation. Every member of the royalty wore a chemise or smock made of fine flax. While we often think of wool as the hero of winter, linen played the most critical role in thermal regulation. Moisture management. The human body, even at rest, produces moisture. In a cold environment, damp skin is a thermal death sentence because water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. Linen is highly absorbent and wicking. It draws perspiration away from the skin and into its fibers, keeping the boundary layer of the body dry. For a monarch, this linen layer was the hygienic buffer that ensured the outer layers of wool and fur remained dry and effective. It was the engine room of the wardrobe, maintaining the dry 37 degrees Celsius (98.6 F) surface temperature required for the internal furnace to function. The second layer, the woolen trap.
Over the linen chemise came the coat or tunic crafted from high-density wool. In the medieval age, wool was the high-performance synthetic of its day. The molecular structure of wool fibers is naturally crimped, meaning they never lie flat against one another. This creates millions of tiny microscopic air vaults within the fabric. When you layer a woolen tunic over a linen chemise, you're essentially plating the body in air. The heat radiating from the skin passes through the linen and becomes trapped in the woolen matrix. For a king, this layer was often fulled, a process where the wool was beaten in water to shrink and thicken it, creating a windproof, water-resistant textile armor. This wasn't just a shirt, it was a fibrous wall that prevented the convective currents of the Great Hall from reaching the body's core. The third layer, the fur lining, the noble insulator. The true sovereign shield of the medieval wardrobe was fur. While today fur is often viewed through the lens of aesthetics, in the 14th century it was industrial-grade insulation. A royal howlandane, a long, voluminous robe, was rarely just cloth. It was a composite membrane lined with the pelts of ermine, miniver, squirrel, or sable. The physics of fur is a masterpiece of evolution. Animal pelts consist of two layers, the long guard hairs that shed moisture and the dense underfur that traps air. When a queen wore a fur-lined gown, she was utilizing millions of years of evolutionary engineering. The fur lining acted as a thermal sponge, absorbing the body's heat and holding it in a dense fibrous cloud around the torso. Because the fur was on the inside of the garment, it created an immediate heat return. As soon as the garment was donned, the reflective warmth began. The stratification of the extremities, hoses and hoods. The medieval inhabitant understood that the body is a leaky vessel, losing heat most rapidly through the head and the legs. To counter this, they utilized sartorial caps. The chouses or hose, like modern trousers, these were individual leg coverings made of bias-cut wool. Because they were tight-fitting, they eliminated dead airspace where cold could pool. The coif and hood. The head was never left bare. A linen coif, a tight-fitting cap, was worn even under a crown or a decorative hat. Over this went a liripipe hood that covered the neck and shoulders. This sealing of the vents was essential. By covering the vascular-rich areas of the neck and scalp, the royalty prevented their blood warmth from being siphoned off by the mineral air of the keep. A king in his winter finery was essentially a closed system, with every joint and seam of his clothing overlapping to ensure no thermal bridge existed between his skin and the stone. The sensory weight of warmth. There was a profound psychological effect to this sartorial mass. A full winter outfit for a nobleman could weigh 30 pounds. This heaviness was synonymous with security. To be well clad was to be thermally armed. When a queen walked through a drafty corridor, she did not feel the wind, she felt the reassuring pressure of the wool and fur against her limbs. The rustle of silk over heavy fleece was the sonic signature of comfort. The infinite history of the royal wardrobe is one of protective density, a boring history of fibers and furs that allowed the human heart to remain blood-warm while the great stasis of the winter turned the world outside to iron. The canine furnace, biological heat sources. In the modern era, we view our pets as companions, but in the medieval castle, a dog was also a piece of mobile thermal technology. While the hearth was a fixed point of warmth and the tapestries were static insulators, the canine furnace provided something the castle's architecture could not: targeted, proximity-based biological heat. For a queen seated in a drafty window bay or a king whose feet were chilled by the limestone floor, a dog was a living hot water bottle with a constant, self-regulating output. In the language of thermodynamics, a dog is a high-energy thermal emitter. When a dog curls up in a human lap or at the feet of a sleeper, it creates a conductive heat bridge. Heat flows from the higher temperature body, the dog, to the lower temperature body. This is not merely a feeling of warmth, it is a literal transfer of caloric energy. For royalty, who often spent hours in sedentary activities, embroidery, reading illuminated manuscripts, or holding court, the dog served as a biological space heater that could be positioned exactly where the thermal leak was most severe. The comforter dog, breeding for heat. The medieval aristocracy didn't just use any dog for this purpose, they engaged in functional breeding. The rise of the comforter dog, the ancestors of the Spaniel, the Maltese and the Bichon Frise, was driven by the need for portability and surface area. These dogs were bred to be small enough to be carried easily, but dense enough to provide a substantial heat signature. Their coats were often long and silken, which served a dual purpose. The fur acted as an insulating buffer, preventing the dog's heat from dissipating too quickly into the cold air of the room, and instead channeling it directly into the person they were touching. Furthermore, the tactile softness of the dog's fur had a psychological warming effect. The act of stroking a warm, soft animal lowers human cortisol levels and slows the heart rate, making the astringent cold of the castle feel less threatening to the nervous system. The foot warmer, defending the extremities. While the lapdog protected the core, the larger hounds, the greyhounds and deerhounds, served as foundation heaters. In the great hall, where the reed and rush meadow could only do so much to block the chill of the floor, the royal family would often rest their feet directly on the flanks of their hunting dogs. This was multi-purpose engineering. The dog benefited from the pooled warmth of the hearth, and the human benefited from the furry platform that elevated their feet off the stone. By placing their feet on a dog, the king or queen effectively short-circuited the thermal drain of the floor. The dog's thick coat and high body temperature acted as a living shield, ensuring that the blood warmth of the legs was not siphoned off by the mineral sinks of the castle's foundation. The night pack, biological security in bed. The most intimate use of the canine firmus occurred behind the velvet latch of the celestial bed. It was common practice for royalty to allow several small dogs into the bedchamber, and often into the bed itself. This was the origin of the phrase three-dog night, though the term evolved later, the practice is ancient. Inside the enclosed volume of the bed curtains, 3 small dogs would contribute roughly 150 to 200 watts of additional heat. This turned the bed into a hyper-insulated biodome. The dogs would naturally seek out the coldest zones, the foot of the bed or the space behind the sleeper's back, and plug the leaks with their own bodies. This symbiotic huddle ensured that even if the fire in the hearth went out, the biological pulse inside the bed remained high enough to ward off the frost. The scent of the hound, a sensory trade-off. To the modern American ear, the idea of sharing a bed with several hounds might sound unhygienic. However, in the medieval olfactory landscape, the smell of a clean, healthy dog was often preferred to the smell of damp masonry or stale tallow. The dogs were frequently groomed with aromatic oils and herb-infused waters to keep fleas at bay. Their presence added a layer of living scent to the room, a musky, warm aroma that was synonymous with protection and vitality. In a world where the great stasis of winter felt like a shadow of death, the rhythmic panting and steady heartbeat of a dog were sonic indicators of life. The dog was the vigilant radiator, a creature that processed the cold and turned it into loyal heat. The portable soul of the castle. As the spring awakening approached, the role of the dog shifted from heater back to hunter. But through the glacial months, these animals were the unsung engineers of royal comfort. They were the only heat source in the castle that could move with the human, providing a constant and targeted radiance. The canine furnace was the final link in the castle's thermal chain, a biological technology that ensured the human heart remained blood warm while the infinite history of the stone remained frozen in the night. The ceramic pig and the water mass strategy. As the Middle Ages progressed, the ritual evolved from stones to ceramic vessels. These were often long cylindrical jugs or pigs made of heavy stoneware. Unlike stones, which provide dry heat, these vessels were filled with boiling water. The advantage of water lies in its thermal volatility. Water has a much higher heat capacity than stone, meaning a ceramic pig could store more energy per square inch. Furthermore, the steam trapped inside the vessel created a moist warmth that was highly effective at opening the fibers of the wool blankets, making the bed feel lofty and soft. These ceramic heaters were often moved around the bed by a servant using a long-handled warming pan, a brass or copper perforated box on a pole, to iron the sheets with heat before the royalty ever entered the room. The strategic deployment, defending the extremities. The placement of these thermal carriers was a matter of clinical precision. They were not simply tossed into the middle of the bed. Instead, they were deployed to defend the body's critical zones. The footwell. The largest stone or pig was placed at the very bottom of the bed. Because the feet are the furthest from the heart and have the least insulating fat, they are the first to succumb to the mineral chill. The small of the back. A flatter, thinner stone was often placed where the sleeper's kidneys would rest, supporting the body's core temperature. The vascular buffer. Smaller stones were sometimes placed near the sides of the mattress to warm the air trapped by the velvet latch of the curtains. This zonal heating meant that the king or queen was not just lying in a room, they were lying in a topographical map of warmth. Everywhere their body touched the bed, they encountered a radiant response. The scent of the hearth in the bedchamber. Because these stones and ceramic vessels spent their day near the hearth, they carried the atmospheric signature of the hearth into the bedchamber. The stones often smelled of toasted earth and wood smoke, while the ceramic pigs, if filled with herb-infused water like lavender or chamomile, would emit a steamy fragrance as they cooled. This created a sensory bridge between the active life of the Great Hall and the static stasis of the bedroom. The olfactory warmth was as important as the physical temperature. To the medieval mind, the smell of a fire-warmed stone was the smell of safety. It was the manual proof that the internal engine of the castle had been successfully packaged and delivered to the sanctuary of the sheets. The morning residue. By dawn, the stones would be lukewarm, their energy spent in the great defense against the night. The ritual would then reverse. The stones were gathered, unwrapped, and returned to the hearth to begin their recharging cycle. This was the rhythmic return of the medieval energy economy. Nothing was wasted. The heat that would have vanished up the chimney was instead captured in stone and used to sustain the human heart through the absolute zero of the winter night. The hot stone ritual was the final mechanical latch in the castle's defense, a simple yet profound technology that turned cold geology into living comfort. The hot stone ritual, transferring the hearth to the sheets.
If the canine furnace was a self-regulating heat source, the hot stone ritual was a deliberate act of mechanical energy transfer. In the medieval castle, warmth was a precious commodity that had to be harvested from the hearth and transported to the furthest reaches of the royal apartments. Before a king or queen climbed into the celestial bed, a secondary ritual took place, the physical migration of the fire's kinetic energy into the cold linens. This was achieved through the use of thermal mass carriers, river stones, bricks, and the precursor to the hot water bottle, the ceramic pig. The physics of latent heat retention. The science behind the hot stone ritual is rooted in specific heat capacity. Different materials absorb and release heat at different rates. While the air in a bedchamber cools almost instantly once a draft enters, a dense material like granite or basalt can hold a significant amount of thermal debt. Medieval stewards understood this intuitively. They would select smooth, rounded river stones, often the size of a loaf of bread, and place them on the periphery of the great hall's hearth early in the evening. These stones would sit for hours, absorbing the long-wave infrared radiation from the glowing charcoal. By the time the royal couple were ready to retire, these stones were vibrating with stored energy. They were no longer just rocks, they were mobile thermal batteries, capable of releasing a steady stream of heat for 6 to 8 hours. The wrapping ritual, the linen buffer. A stone fresh from the hearth is too hot to touch. It would scorch the expensive silk sheets or blister the skin. To manage this, the hot stone ritual involved a sophisticated buffering system. The stones were wrapped in multiple layers of flannel or heavy linen. This was not just for safety, it was an exercise in rate of decay management. By wrapping the stone, the servant created a thermal resistance layer. Instead of the stone dumping all its heat into the bed in 30 minutes, the linen wrapping ensured a slow leaching of warmth. This turned the stone into a regulated radiator. The goal was to reach a thermal equilibrium where the bed was warmed to exactly 100 degrees Fahrenheit and held there throughout the deep sleep cycle. For the American listener, this is the medieval version of a smart heating pad, completely silent, cordless, and powered by the residual energy of the forest. The capillary cloak, sealing the thermal chimney. In the medieval winter, the human body was viewed as a vessel of vital heat, and the head was its most dangerous leak. While the celestial bed and the linen layers protected the torso and limbs, the head often remained exposed to the ambient drafts of the stone chamber. To the medieval physician and the royal steward, the scalp was a thermal chimney, a high-traffic vascular zone where the body's internal furnace could be rapidly depleted. The solution was the capillary cloak, a system of vascular sealing through the use of specialized headwear that turned the act of sleeping into a final airtight defensive posture. The physics of the cranial heat sink. The nightcap is rooted in the body's thermographic priority. The human brain requires a massive amount of blood flow to function, and because the scalp lacks a significant layer of subcutaneous fat, unlike the thighs or torso, the blood vessels are positioned very close to the surface of the skin. In a cold environment, the head acts as a radiant fin. Much like the cooling fins or a modern engine, the scalp facilitates the transfer of heat from the blood to the surrounding air. If a king slept with a bare head in a room at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, his body would prioritize keeping his brain warm, shunting heat away from his extremities to compensate for the cranial hemorrhage of energy. By covering the head, the medieval sleeper was not just keeping their ears warm, they were plugging the thermal leak, allowing the body to maintain a stable core temperature with significantly less metabolic effort. The coif, the primary biological seal. The first layer of the capillary cloak was the coif.
For a queen or a nobleman, this was a tight-fitting cap made of the finest bleached linen. It was designed to sit flush against the skin, following the contours of the skull and tying under the chin. The coif functioned as a vapor barrier. Just as the linen camise managed moisture on the body, the coif absorbed the insensible perspiration from the scalp. This was vital because a damp head is a cold head. By keeping the skin dry and creating a static air layer directly against the hair, the coif acted as the primary insulator. For the royalty, the coif was the invisible shield, often worn under more decorative hats during the day and as the foundational layer of the sleep system at night. The knighthood, engineering the shoulder gate. Over the coif went the knighthood, or biggin. This was a more substantial garment made of double-milled wool or quilted silk. Unlike a modern beanie which only covers the crown, the medieval knighthood was a comprehensive enclosure. The genius of the knighthood lay in its cervical extension. It didn't just cover the hair, it extended down to cover the nape of the neck and the shoulder girdle. In the physics of the bed environment, the most common point of cold entry is the gap between the pillow and the blankets. This is the shoulder gate. By wearing a hood that tucked deep into the nightshirt or under the blankets, the sleeper created an overlapping joint. This ensured that no matter how much the king turned in his sleep, the thermal envelope remained unbroken. The hood acted as a gasket, sealing the junction between the body's insulation and the bed's enclosure. The acoustic insulation of the cloak. There was a secondary non-thermal benefit to the capillary cloak: sensory deprivation. A thick wool hood over the ears provided a significant acoustic buffer. In a castle where the wind whistled through the spiral staircases and the great hall's respiration created a constant low-frequency hum, the knighthood provided a muffled sanctuary. This sonic softening was essential for entering the deep states of REM sleep required for biological recovery. By sealing the ears, the hood didn't just protect the body's heat, it protected the mind's peace. The king slept in a world of felt, where the hostile sounds of the winter were reduced to a distant, harmless thrum. The sign of the sovereign, materials and status. Even in the darkness of the celestial bed, status was maintained through the chemistry of the fabric. The king's hood might be made of satin-lined velvet, providing a reflective thermal surface that bounced body heat back toward the scalp. The queen's coif, often embroidered with silk thread and infused with lavender water, turning the capillary cloak into a portable aromatherapy unit. These materials weren't just for luxury, they were chosen for their frictional properties. Silk and high thread count linen prevented the hair from tangling and reduced the mechanical irritation of the skin during the night. A comfortable sleeper is a still sleeper, and a still sleeper loses less heat. The great stasis of the night was never interrupted by the thermal shock of a shifted blanket. The morning unveiling of the head. When the hot stone ritual had ended and the morning light touched the tapestry membrane, the removal of the capillary cloak marked the beginning of the day. The head, having been incubated all night, was released into the astringent air of the chamber. This was often accompanied by a vigor-inducing splash of rose water or a quick grooming by a valet. The capillary cloak had done its duty. It had redacted the winter from the most vulnerable part of the royal anatomy. By sealing the chimney, the medieval aristocracy had turned the architecture of the head into a fortress of heat, proving that the infinite history of survival was often found in the smallest, boring details of a linen tie and a woolen fold.
The communal huddle, the social physics of shared radiance. In the modern world, privacy is the ultimate luxury, often defined by the ability to retreat into a room of one's own.
However, in the medieval winter, privacy was a thermal liability. To sleep alone was to surrender one's biological energy to the vast cold emptiness of the stone. For the kings and queens of the Middle Ages, survival and comfort were rooted in the communal huddle, a strategic social negotiation where the biological radiance of many was pooled to create a single shared microclimate. The thermodynamics of the group. The human body is an engine that constantly leaks heat. In a vacuum of isolation, that heat is lost to the environment. But when bodies are placed in close proximity, they create a thermal feedback loop. This is the physics of the huddle. In the royal bedchamber, the king and queen did not sleep in solitary isolation. The celestial bed was often a crowded space. Beyond the royal couple, it was not uncommon for high-ranking attendants, ladies-in-waiting, or even trusted squires to sleep in the same room on trundle beds or directly on the reed meadow near the base of the royal dais. This wasn't merely a matter of security, it was a matter of atmospheric priming. The collective metabolic output of 6 or 7 people in a medium-sized solar would raise the ambient temperature of the air by several degrees before anyone even crawled under the covers. The body heat economy. Inside the bed itself, the huddle was literal. The presence of bed warmers, not the ceramic pigs mentioned in Chapter 9, but actual human beings, was a recorded practice. A groom of the chamber might be tasked with lying in the royal bed for an hour before the monarch retired, effectively pre-charging the down mattresses and wool blankets with their own body heat. Once the king and queen entered the bed, they relied on conductive synergy. By sleeping close together, they reduced the exposed surface area of their bodies. Instead of 2 separate entities fighting the cold, they became a single biological unit with a shared core. This social heat was the most reliable form of energy in the castle. Unlike the hearth, which could burn out, or the stones, which eventually cooled, the human engine remained at a constant 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit as long as it was fueled by the evening meal. The trundle bed, vertical layering of heat. For the attendants, the trundle bed offered a unique thermal advantage. These were low beds on wheels that could be pushed under the great bed during the day. At night, they were pulled out and positioned as close to the sovereign pod as possible. This created a vertical gradient of warmth. As the heat from the attendants' bodies rose, it contributed to the thermal cushion beneath the royal mattress. Conversely, the radiant shadow of the massive 4-poster bed protected those on the floor from the cold air plumes that might leak from the ceiling. It was a symbiotic stratification, a social hierarchy that doubled as a thermal defense system. The breath cloud and atmospheric stability. One of the most profound effects of the communal huddle was the stabilization of the air's moisture and temperature. In an empty room, the air is thin and sharp. In a room filled with the quiet respiration of several people, the air becomes dense. This breath cloud increased the relative humidity of the solar. While we often think of humidity as uncomfortable, in a dry winter castle, a bit of moisture in the air actually helps the environment hold heat better than bone-dry air. The collective breathing of the huddle turned the solar into a biological greenhouse. The air felt softer and thicker, providing a sensory shield that made the mineral reality of the limestone walls feel miles away. The psychological shield of the huddle. Beyond the measurable calories, the communal huddle provided psychological insulation. The sound of the medieval night was not the silence of a modern suburb, it was the rhythmic symphony of the huddle. The
The steady breathing, the rustle of straw, and the muffled snore of a loyal guard were the acoustic proof that one was not alone in the dark. In a world where winter was often associated with stasis and death, the vibrancy of the group was a powerful antidepressant. This social radiance allowed the royalty to drift into sleep with a sense of kinetic security. They weren't just surviving the cold, they were defying the dark through the power of the human collective. The morning social thaw. When the dawn finally broke, the huddle didn't just disperse, it transitioned into the social thaw of the morning ritual. The attendants who had shared the room's warmth were already there to begin the hearth resurrection and the unveiling of the royal wardrobe. The communal huddle was the final latch in the castle's social and thermal architecture. It was a reminder that in the infinite history of the Middle Ages, the most effective technology for warmth was not made of stone, wood, or iron. It was made of humanity. By trading the luxury of privacy for the sovereign radiance of the group, the kings and queens of old ensured that the great stasis of winter remained a boring history of safety, sleep, and shared warmth.
The spring awakening, the mineral exhalation. If the medieval winter was a period of biological contraction, then the arrival of spring was the castle's great exhalation. This was not merely a change in the weather, it was a profound architectural transition. After months of being sealed, draped, and insulated, the castle had to be reawakened from its long mineral slumber. The process of the spring awakening was a ritualized cleansing that involved the purging of the stagnant and the reintegration of the castle with the natural world. The physics of the thermal lag. One of the most curious phenomena of the spring awakening was the thermal lag of the masonry. While the outside air might begin to feel balmy in April, the interior of the castle often remained glacially cold. Because the limestone walls were several feet thick, they acted as a cold reservoir. It took weeks of consistent sunlight to vibrate the chill out of the stone's core. This created a seasonal paradox. The king might find himself sweating in the sun on the battlements, only to feel a frosty bite the moment he stepped back into the great hall. To solve this, the stewards practiced atmospheric flushing, opening every window and door to force the warm spring air to scour the cold stone surfaces. The stripping of the skin, dismantling the tapestries. The woven walls that had protected the inhabitants from the mineral predation were taken down, beaten to remove the winter's dust, and stored in cedar-lined chests. This act was visually jarring. Suddenly, the castle felt vast and raw again. The bare limestone, once hidden behind scenes of hunts and forests, was exposed to the light. This was a necessary hygienic purge. The wool had absorbed the humidity and smoke of the winter. By removing it, the staff allowed the walls to breathe. The castle shifted from a soft, fibrous sanctuary back into a hard, mineral fortress. The Great Raking, rebirthing the floor. The Reed and Rush Meadow, Chapter 4, which had accumulated layers of organic history over the winter, underwent a total extraction. The old compacted mats of straw and herbs were raked up and carried out to the fields. This was more than just cleaning, it was the return of the nutrients. The winter floor of the castle became the fertilizer for the summer's crops. A new, much thinner layer of fresh green rushes was strewn, often mixed with spring flowers like primrose and violet. The scent of the castle changed overnight, from the musky warmth of the huddle to the astringent clarity of the meadow. The solar inversion, opening the light ports. During the winter, the solar retreat was a place of shadow and flame. In the spring, it became a light trap. The heavy wooden shutters were thrown open, and for the first time in months, the full spectrum of sunlight entered the room. This luminous inundation was the signal for the recalibration of the senses. The celestial bed was stripped of its heavy winter velvet and replaced with light silk or linen hangings. The canine furnace moved from the lap to the garden, and the hot stone ritual was retired until the following autumn. The castle was no longer a cocoon, it was an observatory, a place to witness the spring awakening of the valley below. The mineral rebirth. As the spring awakening concluded, the castle stood transformed. It was no longer a hostile engine of survival, but a vibrant center of administration and ceremony. The great stasis had been defeated not by fighting the cold, but by flowing with it, by utilizing the physics of the huddle, the capillary cloak, and the woven membrane. The infinite history of the medieval castle is a story of rhythmic adaptation. It reminds us that comfort is not a constant state, but a dynamic negotiation with the environment. As the king walked through his newly exhaled halls, he did so with the knowledge that the boring history of his winter survival was the very thing that allowed for the vibrant future of his spring reign. The castle had breathed in the winter, and now, with the scent of lavender and the warmth of the sun, it finally breathed out.
That is where the true spirit of how did kings and queens sleep in medieval castles during harsh winters without modern heating rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night.